If you had told me that morning that I'd be standing in a church coat room holding a letter that could end a wedding, I would have laughed and gone back to fixing my tie. 40 minutes later, I wasn't laughing. 40 minutes later, Sabrina Colton pressed an envelope into my hand, looked at me like she was memorizing my face for the last time, and said 6 words that split my entire life into a before and an after. Don't open it unless you're sure. Sure of what? Sure the wedding was actually happening. Sure I could sit in the third pew and clap for a man I'd spent 18 months quietly resenting. Sure I wasn't about to do something so reckless it would follow me for the rest of my life. She didn't explain. She just closed my fingers around the envelope, held my eyes 1 second longer than a bride in a wedding gown has any business holding her brother's best friend's eyes, and walked back toward the bridal suite like she hadn't just handed me a live wire with the insulation already stripped off. My name is Marcus Bellweather. I'm 34. I design custom homes for a living. And up until that morning, I would have told you I had my emotions filed, labeled, and locked in a drawer I never opened. Sabrina Colton was the reason that drawer existed in the first place. I need to slow down here because if I don't give you the whole shape of this story, you're going to spend the next 10 minutes thinking I'm the villain. Honestly, some days I still wonder if I am. So let me start where it actually started, not where the panic started. I met Sabrina when she was 13 and I was 19. I was a lanky college freshman crashing at her older brother's house every other weekend, eating cereal at their kitchen table while she sat across from me sketching horses in a spiral notebook and asking questions no 13-year-old should have been sharp enough to ask. Her brother, Grant Colton, was my best friend from the time we were sophomores in high school. The kind of friendship that survives moves, breakups, bad jobs, and the slow drift adulthood tries to put between people. Sabrina was just the little sister. That was the label. That was supposed to be the whole story. It wasn't, but I want to say clearly on the record before this goes any further. In the years she was underage, I never once said or did a single inappropriate thing to Sabrina Colton. Not a look, not a lingering hug, nothing that would have made Grant want to put my head through drywall. What happened between us happened much later, after she was fully grown. After the 6-year gap that once felt enormous had quietly shrunk down into something that barely registered. By the time I was 34 and she was 28, 6 years stopped being a fence and became a footnote. But the label best friend's little sister never got the memo. And there is no cage in the world more airtight than the one built out of everyone else's expectations of you. I watched Sabrina grow up the way you watch a tree outside your kitchen window. So gradually you don't notice the changes until one day you look up and it's twice the size you remember, and you can't pinpoint when that happened. She went from sketching horses to painting real portraits, good enough that her art teacher tried to get her into a summer program downtown. She went from tagging along on Grant's and my trips to the batting cages to a teenager rolling her eyes at both of us from the backseat of Grant's car, headphones in, pretending she wasn't listening to every word. Then she left for college 9 hours away, and for 4 years I mostly saw her at Thanksgiving. And every single Thanksgiving she came back a little more finished, a little more herself. Until the year she came home at 22 with a marketing job offer in the city and a laugh that landed somewhere I wasn't prepared for. I remember the exact moment it happened. Grant's parents' dining room, string lights strung along the back porch, Sabrina mid-story about her college roommate's disastrous pottery class, the whole table wheezing. I sat there watching her hands move while she talked. She always talked with her hands like she was still sketching something in the air. And I thought very clearly, very inconveniently, oh no. I didn't act on it obviously. She was my best friend's little sister. She was 22 and I was 28. And even though the math wasn't actually strange, plenty of couples carry bigger gaps than that without anyone blinking. It still felt like standing too close to a fire I'd promised myself I'd never touch. I told myself it was a holiday dinner feeling, something that would evaporate the second she went back to the city and I went back to my normal, mildly lonely life. It didn't evaporate. It got worse, the way things always get worse when you refuse to look directly at them, and instead let them grow quietly in the one corner of your chest you've agreed never to check. I remember the drive home from that Thanksgiving with an embarrassing amount of clarity. I sat in my own driveway for almost 20 minutes before going inside, running through every reason this was a terrible idea. She's Grant's sister. You've known her since she was a kid, which makes this feel wrong even when the math says it isn't. You will lose your best friend if you get this wrong. You'll lose her too. And then you'll have lost both of the people who matter most over a feeling you could have just kept quietly buried. That last thought won for the next 6 years. The Thanksgivings that followed settled into a pattern I got extremely good at not examining. Sabrina would show up with some new piece of her life, fully assembled: a promotion, a new apartment, a haircut that made me temporarily forget how sentences worked, and I would spend the whole visit being the world's most attentive listener, asking follow-up questions, remembering things she'd mentioned once months earlier in passing. I told myself this was just what good friends did. Grant used to tease me about it in that easy, oblivious way people tease people they've long since decided aren't a threat. "You know more about Sabby's life than I do," he told me once, laughing like it was a punchline instead of a warning label. "You two should just get married and save the rest of us the seating chart logistics." He meant it as a joke. I laughed along like it was one. Sabrina, sitting 3 ft away, went suddenly very interested in her drink. I told myself that was a coincidence too. I told myself a lot of things. Over the next 6 years, from 22 to 28, Sabrina and I built something that never got a name because neither of us was brave enough to name it. She started texting me directly, not just in the group thread with Grant included. Small things at first: a photo of a house with good bones because she knew I'd appreciate the roofline, a question about whether a specific shade of teal would work in a canvas she was finishing, a "you up" at midnight that was never about anything more than wanting to talk through her day. But that made my stomach drop every single time the notification lit up my screen anyway. I told myself this was normal. Friends text friends at midnight. Except I didn't text any of Grant's other friends about paint colors at midnight. And Grant never seemed to notice, because in his mind the label was so solid it never occurred to him there might be something underneath it worth questioning. Sabrina dated during those 6 years, not constantly but enough to matter. A guy from her graduate program who lasted 8 months. A coworker who lasted almost a year before she found out he'd been seeing someone else on the side. Every time one of those relationships ended, she called me before she called anyone else. Before her mother, before her college roommate, before Grant. I told myself that was because I gave good advice, because I was safe, because I was the reliable, brother-adjacent friend who wouldn't judge her for crying at 1:00 in the morning. I never once let myself entertain the possibility that some part of her was checking to see if I'd finally say the thing I never said. I never said it. I was a coward about exactly one thing in my entire adult life, and it happened to be the one thing that mattered most. Then 18 months before the wedding, when Sabrina was 26 and I was 32, she met Bennett Voss. Bennett was by every objective measure a genuinely good match on paper. Successful in commercial real estate, tall in the way that makes a room notice him without trying. Charming in that specific, rehearsed but effective way charming men are charming. Grant liked him immediately. Sabrina's parents liked him immediately. He remembered birthdays. He showed up to family dinners early with decent wine. He asked Grant for advice on the ring like a man who genuinely understood the assignment. Everyone said Sabrina had finally found someone who matched her energy: ambitious, put together, someone who photographed well standing next to her. I said all the right things too, because what else was there to say? I congratulated her over a phone call I had to grit my jaw through the entire time. I told her Bennett seemed like a great guy. I told her I was happy for her. Half of that was even true. I was happy for her in the abstract, theoretical sense. You can be happy for someone, while a different, uglier part of you is quietly grieving something you never had the right to grieve in the first place. The wedding was set for the second Saturday of June at a stone chapel 40 minutes outside the city, with the reception at a vineyard nearby. Grant asked me to be a groomsman, which meant I'd spend the biggest day of Sabrina's life standing at the front of that chapel watching her marry someone else, wearing a rented tuxedo and a smile I would have to build from absolute scratch. I said yes because saying no would have required an explanation I wasn't ready to give, and because some stubborn, self-deceiving part of me still believed I could get through it if I just kept my head down and did my job. The bachelor weekend happened 3 weeks before the wedding at a lake house Bennett's college friends had rented. I remember standing on the dock at 2 in the morning while everyone else slept off the night, staring at black water, asking myself seriously, honestly, for the first time, whether I actually intended to stand up in that chapel and watch this happen. I didn't have an answer. I had never let myself get far enough into the question to find one. Bennett wandered out and joined me at some point. A little drunk, sentimental in the specific way men get sentimental right before their whole lives change shape. He told me how grateful he was that Sabrina had someone like me in her corner, someone who clearly cared about her happiness as much as he did. I said something appropriately warm back. I don't remember what. I remember mostly wanting to walk into the lake and not resurface. 2 weeks before the wedding, Sabrina called me at 11 at night, the way she always used to after a rough day. Except this time, it wasn't about a bad date or a hard week at work. It was about seating charts and whether her aunt could sit anywhere near her uncle without an international incident. Halfway through the call, she went quiet in a way I recognized. The specific silence she used right before she said something she hadn't planned on saying out loud. "Can I ask you something strange?" she said. "You can ask me anything," I said, which was true in every way except the one that mattered. "Do you think people always end up with the right person?" she asked. "Or do you think sometimes people just end up with whoever was standing closest when they finally got tired of waiting?" I sat with that question longer than I should have before answering. Long enough that she said my name once, checking if the call had dropped. "I think some people get scared and settle for whoever's standing closest," I finally said. "And I think some people are too scared to say anything at all." So the person waiting never even finds out there was another option in the room. It was the closest either of us had ever come to saying it out loud. Neither of us pushed further. She said good night a few minutes later. I lay awake for hours replaying her voice on that question, wondering if I had just watched the last exit disappear behind a wedding I had no power to stop, or if impossibly there'd be one more. I did not get through wedding day the way I'd planned. Nothing about that day went the way anyone had planned, starting with the moment Sabrina found me alone in the coat room. This was just past 10 in the morning. The ceremony was set for 11:30. I'd gone looking for a quiet corner to fix my tie without an audience because my hands weren't steady enough to trust in front of the other groomsmen. And the coat room off the side hallway seemed safest. I was wrong about that too. Sabrina was already in her dress, hair half-pinned, makeup half-finished, looking like something out of a painting she'd have made fun of if someone else had painted it. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that coat room. She was supposed to be upstairs with her mother, her bridesmaids, and a photographer documenting every second of getting ready for an album nobody would open again after the first year. "Hey," she said, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world for the bride to be alone in a coat room 40 minutes before her own ceremony. "Hey," I said, hands frozen on my tie. "Shouldn't you be, I don't know, being a bride somewhere?" "I needed 2 minutes," she said, and there was an edge in her voice I didn't recognize, thin, stretched as a wire pulled tight enough to hum. "Everyone keeps touching my hair. That does sound like a crisis." She almost laughed, almost. It caught halfway and turned into something smaller and sadder, a breath more than a sound. That was the first moment I understood something was wrong, really wrong, not just bride nerves wrong. "You okay?" I asked because it was the only question that made any sense. "That question's very popular today," she said. "Everyone keeps asking like they already know the answer and just want to watch me lie about it." Something flickered across her face at that. "No," she said quietly. "You're really not." Then she reached into the small clutch matching her dress and pulled out a cream-colored envelope sealed. With nothing written on the front, except my name and handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. The same handwriting that used to sign birthday cards and leave notes tucked under my windshield wiper when she borrowed my car in college. "What is that?" I said. It wasn't really a question. It was a warning to myself. "A letter," she said, like that wasn't already obvious. "For me," she held it out. I didn't take it right away and she noticed, and something in her jaw tightened like she was bracing for me to refuse. I took it. The paper was heavier than I expected. The kind of stock you buy when you want something to feel important before a single word is even read. "What's it say?" I asked, turning it over like the answer might be printed on the back. "I can't tell you that," she said. "That's the entire point of a letter. Sabrina, don't open it unless you're sure," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word sure, just enough that I heard it. Just enough that I knew saying it cost her something. "Please, I need you to promise me that." "Sure of what?" I said, and I meant it. I genuinely didn't understand what she was asking me to be sure of. Sure, I wanted to know whatever the letter said. Sure about something bigger and far more dangerous than curiosity. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that carries an entire conversation nobody's actually saying out loud. And then her mother's voice cut down the hallway, bright and a little frantic, wondering where the bride had disappeared to, with her hair half-pinned and the photographer waiting. "I have to go," Sabrina said. "Sabrina, wait." Promise me, she said, already backing toward the door, already becoming again the bride the rest of the day expected. Promise me you won't open it unless you're sure. Sure of what? I said one more time. But she was already gone, disappearing down the hall in a swirl of white fabric and unanswered questions, leaving me alone in a coat room. Holding a sealed envelope 40 minutes before she was set to marry Bennett Voss, in front of 200 people who had no idea the morning had just cracked open a door none of us knew existed. I put the envelope in my jacket pocket. My hands were not steady, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I stood in that coat room for a full minute just breathing, trying to talk myself into believing it was nothing. A nice note, a thank you for being my friend kind of thing. Brides write to people they care about. I almost believed it. I might have kept believing it if it hadn't been for the way her voice cracked on the word sure, and the way she'd looked at me like she was asking a question with her entire face that her mouth wasn't allowed to say out loud. I did not open the letter. Not then. I walked back out to the main hall where the other groomsmen were adjusting cufflinks and cracking jokes about Bennett's nerves. And I put on the version of myself that could stand next to those men, laugh along, and pretend my chest wasn't doing something complicated and painful. Bennett found me a few minutes later, already in his tux, grinning the wide, easy grin of a man who has never once doubted his life was going according to plan. "Marcus," he said, clapping my shoulder. "Big day, huh? Big day," I agreed, and the words tasted strange in my mouth. "Thanks for being up there with me," he said, and he meant it. I could tell he meant it, which somehow made everything worse. "Sabby talks about you like you're some kind of legend, Marcus this, Marcus that." I told her I was starting to get jealous of a guy I've never even seen flirt with her. I laughed because that's what you do, and it came out sounding almost normal. And Bennett didn't notice anything wrong because why would he? He had no reason to suspect the best man's college roommate's best friend was standing 3 ft away with a sealed letter from his bride burning a hole through his jacket pocket. "She's a good friend," I said. It was the truest and least true sentence I'd said all day. "The best," Bennett said, before someone pulled him away to deal with a boutonniere emergency, and I was alone again with my own thoughts, which by that point had become a very crowded and unpleasant place to stand. I want to tell you I spent the next 30 minutes being noble, staying focused, doing my job, not letting my mind wander anywhere it had no business wandering. I did not do that. I spent the next 30 minutes replaying 15 years of small moments. I had spent 15 years talking myself out of the midnight texts, the phone calls after every failed relationship. The way she always saved me a seat at every family gathering without ever announcing she was doing it. The way she'd looked at me in that coat room like the letter in my pocket was a question, and I was somehow supposed to already know the answer. The ceremony started at 11:30 exactly because Sabrina's mother, Renata, ran a schedule tight enough to reset the sun if it dared show up late. I stood at the front of that stone chapel next to Grant, practically vibrating with pride over his little sister, and next to Bennett, who kept checking his watch like the minutes between now and Sabrina walking down the aisle were the longest of his life. I felt the envelope in my jacket pocket like it had its own heartbeat. The doors opened, the music started, and Sabrina Colton walked into that chapel on her father's arm, and every single person in every pew turned to look at her. And I understood with a clarity that genuinely frightened me that I was not looking at her the way a groomsman is supposed to look at a bride. I was looking at her the way you look at something you're about to lose forever, memorizing every detail before it becomes a thing you only get to remember instead of a thing you actually get to have. She didn't look at me as she walked. I want to be clear about that. She smiled at Bennett. She smiled at her mother. She did every single thing a bride is supposed to do on the happiest day of her life. But there was something underneath the smile, something careful and controlled, like she was performing a version of happiness she'd rehearsed rather than living inside one she actually felt. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe 15 years of buried feelings will make a man see cracks in a painting that isn't actually cracked. But I didn't think I was imagining it. I had known this woman since she was 13 years old. I knew the difference between her real smile and her careful one, and the one she wore walking down that aisle was careful. The ceremony moved through its usual shape. Readings, a song her cousin sang slightly off-key that made half the room tear up anyway. The efficient talking about love and commitment in the general, borrowed language efficients always use. Words that could apply to any two people standing at any altar in the world. Then it reached the vows and Bennett went first, and his were good, genuinely good, funny in the right places, sincere in the right places. The kind of vows a man writes when he's actually thought about the specific person he's marrying instead of just the abstract idea of marriage. Then it was Sabrina's turn. She unfolded a small piece of paper, the same cream-colored stock as the envelope still sitting in my pocket. I noticed, though I told myself that was a coincidence, that plenty of stationery stores sold that exact shade of cream. She looked at Bennett. She looked at the paper. And then, for one full second, her eyes lifted and found me standing 3 feet behind Bennett's shoulder in my rented tuxedo, holding my breath without meaning to. 1 second, maybe two. Nobody else in that chapel would have noticed because nobody else had spent 15 years learning to read every flicker on Sabrina Colton's face. But I noticed. And what I saw in that flicker wasn't the look of a woman who was sure. It was the look of a woman standing at the edge of something, trying to convince herself to jump anyway because turning around felt more terrifying than falling. She started reading her vows. Her voice shook slightly on the very first line. The officiant asked if she needed a moment. She said no, she was fine and kept going. And the vows were beautiful, honestly, full of real memories, real affection. The kind of vows that would have convinced me completely if I hadn't been standing exactly where I was standing, hearing exactly what I'd heard in that coat room 40 minutes earlier. Then halfway through the third paragraph she stopped, just stopped mid-sentence. The paper trembled in her hands. The whole chapel went silent in that specific, suffocating way a room goes silent when everyone senses something's wrong but nobody knows what yet. Bennett reached for her hand, his face shifting from confusion into concern. Renata half rose from the front pew, and Sabrina stood there in her white dress in front of 200 people. Looking like she'd just realized she was standing on the edge of a cliff she hadn't noticed climbing. "Sabby," Bennett said quietly. She looked at him, then slowly, terribly, she looked past him again, back at me, and this time she didn't look away after 1 second. She held it. The whole chapel seemed to feel that current running between two people standing in the wrong configuration for the moment they were in. "I can't," she said. It came out barely above a whisper, but the chapel was so silent by then it carried to every single pew. "What?" Bennett said, and now the concern had shifted into something closer to fear. "I can't do this," Sabrina said, louder now, steadier, like saying it once had cracked something open and the rest came easier. "Bennett, I am so sorry. I can't marry you." The chapel erupted into the specific noise 200 people make when they're all trying to whisper simultaneously, which is somehow louder than if they just shouted outright. Grant grabbed my arm without seeming to realize he was doing it. Renata was already moving down the aisle. Bennett stood frozen, his face doing something I genuinely felt sorry for. A complicated collapse of confusion, humiliation, and hurt, all happening at once in front of every person he knew. "Why?" Bennett said, his voice breaking on the word in a way that made me feel like the worst person alive because some ugly, selfish corner of my chest was underneath the sympathy feeling something that could only honestly be described as hope. I hated myself for that in that moment more than I've ever hated myself for anything before or since. Sabrina looked at him with something genuinely apologetic, genuinely gentle, because whatever else was true, she did care about Bennett. That much was obvious in the way she reached for his hand, even as she was ending everything between them. "Because I've spent months trying to convince myself I love you enough for this," she said. "And I do love you, I do. But I don't think I've ever let myself love you the way you deserve to be loved. Because some part of me has been holding on to something else for so long, I didn't even realize I was still holding it until this morning." "What are you talking about?" Bennett said. And I watched his eyes track the invisible line running from her straight to me. Watched his face change as the pieces assembled themselves into a picture he clearly did not want to see. "You," Bennett said, turning to look at me directly for the first time since the vows had stopped, his voice gone very quiet. "This is about you, Adrian Bennett." I started, though I genuinely had no idea what the rest of that sentence was going to be. "Did something happen?" Bennett said, still looking straight at me, and I could see Grant out of the corner of my eye. His own face doing its own slow collapse, as he began to understand what the rest of the room had already guessed. "Between you two, did something happen?" "No," Sabrina said before I could answer, stepping toward Bennett instead of toward me, which I noticed and which mattered. "Nothing happened, Bennett. That's not what this is. Marcus hasn't done anything wrong. This isn't his fault, it's mine. I got engaged to you because you were good and steady and everyone approved, and I thought that would be enough to make the other feeling disappear. And it didn't, and that's not fair to you. And I am so, so sorry." The chapel had gone from murmuring to a kind of stunned, mortified silence. 200 people suddenly finding their programs and their own shoes very interesting. Desperate to look anywhere except at the three of us standing at the front of a wedding that had just come apart at every seam. Bennett stood there for a long moment, and then, to his enormous credit, a credit I did not expect and honestly still respect him for, he nodded once slowly. Like a man accepting a diagnosis he'd already suspected for a while. Okay, he said quietly. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at Sabrina, and his voice, when it came again, was gentler than I deserved to hear. I think I need to not be in this building right now. He turned and walked back down the aisle alone, past 200 silent guests, and nobody stopped him because there was nothing left to stop him for. Sabrina stood at the altar in her wedding dress, no groom beside her, the whole chapel staring, and for one terrible second I thought she might collapse under the weight of what she'd just done. Then she turned, found me again, and this time there was nothing careful in her expression at all. You still have the letter, she said. It wasn't a question. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled it out. My hands were shaking, hers were too. I noticed when she stepped down off the altar and crossed the small distance between us, the guests parting instinctively, Grant's mouth hanging open somewhere behind me. Open it now, she said. I need you to open it right now. I broke the seal with hands that didn't feel like they belonged to me. Inside was a single page, her handwriting filling every line. And I read it standing right there, in front of 200 people who had already watched one wedding collapse, and were now apparently about to watch whatever came next. The letter said everything she'd never let herself say out loud. It said she had been in love with me since she was 22, since that Thanksgiving dinner under the string lights. That she had watched me for years, trying to figure out if I felt anything back, and had eventually convinced herself I didn't, because I never said anything, because I was always so careful. So controlled, so committed to a label neither of us had ever actually agreed to. It said she'd gotten engaged to Bennett partly because he was good and kind and available, and partly because some desperate corner of her had hoped that marrying someone else would finally make the feeling for me disappear. It said that morning, getting her hair pinned by hands that weren't mine. She'd looked in the mirror and known with total clarity that she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life if she didn't at least give me the chance to be sure, one way or another. Before she said words in front of God and 200 witnesses that she could never take back. At the very bottom, in handwriting that had clearly been shaking as she wrote it, I don't expect anything from you, Marcus. I just needed you to know before I disappeared into being someone's wife forever. If you're sure you don't feel the same, burn this and never mention it, and I promise I'll be the best version of Bennett's wife I know how to be. But if there's any part of you that's ever wondered the same thing I have, please, for both our sakes, be sure before it's too late for either of us to do anything about it. Sabrina stood right in front of me in her wedding dress. In a chapel full of people who had just watched her leave one man standing at the altar, waiting to find out if she'd just made the single bravest and most humiliating decision of her life for absolutely nothing. Sabrina, I'm sure, I said, her whole face changed, not carefully this time, completely. Sure of what? She said, echoing my own question back at me from the coat room. Something almost laughing underneath it now, something breaking open with relief instead of grief. Sure that I've been in love with you since you were 22 and I was too much of a coward to say it, I said. Sure that every single time you called me after a bad date, some part of me was quietly grateful the date had gone badly. Sure that I've spent 6 years, no, 15 years, telling myself this was just friendship because the alternative felt too dangerous to touch. I'm sure, Sabrina, I've been sure for a very long time. I just never let myself say it out loud. She let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in her chest for years. And then she closed the last few feet between us, and in front of 200 wedding guests, her father, her mother, and a best friend named Grant, who would later tell me he had never in his life been more shocked and somehow less surprised at the exact same time. Sabrina Colton kissed me in the middle of the wedding she had just walked out of. I will not stand here and pretend the aftermath was simple. It wasn't. The chapel emptied out in a slow, awkward wave. 200 people dressed for a celebration filing into a parking lot full of confused caterers, and a wedding planner on her phone trying to figure out what to do with a reception nobody was sure was still happening. Renata pulled Sabrina aside almost immediately, and I watched from a distance a conversation full of hand gestures, and at least one moment where Renata pressed both palms to her own face like she was trying to physically hold her head together. Sabrina's father, to his enormous credit, walked straight past his daughter, straight past me, and out to the parking lot to find Bennett before he could drive off alone. Because whatever else was true, that man had raised his daughter well enough to know somebody needed to check on the person who'd just been left standing at an altar. Grant found me by the coat room where the whole thing had started, arms crossed, jaw tight, looking at me like he was deciding whether we were still friends. "How long?" he said, just that 2 words. "Grant, how long, Marcus?" "I never acted on anything," I said, which was true and which felt like a very small defense against the size of what had just happened. "Nothing happened between us while she was engaged. Nothing happened before that either. I just never stopped." I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. Grant had known me for 25 years. He could fill in the blank himself. He was quiet for a long moment. And then he said the thing I didn't expect, the thing that told me our friendship, battered as it was in that instant, was going to survive this. "You know the stupidest part," he said. "I used to wonder why you never dated anyone seriously. I used to think something was wrong with you. Never once thought to look in my own house." He shook his head, half a laugh escaping despite himself, the kind of laugh that comes out when a person is too tired to keep being angry. "I need a few weeks," he said, "not because I hate you, because I need to stop being the guy in this story who didn't see it coming." He got his few weeks. It stretched into almost 2 months, filled with short, polite texts and none of the daily back and forth that had defined our friendship for 2 decades. I'll be honest with you, those 2 months were some of the loneliest of my life. Worse in some ways than the 6 years I'd spent saying nothing to Sabrina. Because at least during those years I still had Grant. When he finally called, it was a random Tuesday night, no warning. And the first thing he said was, "Sabby says you designed her a house." I told him I had. He was quiet for a second and then he said, "Show me the blueprint sometime," which from Grant was as close to a full reconciliation as I was ever going to get. It was enough. It was more than enough. Bennett needed longer, and I don't blame him for a single day of it. I saw him once, about 5 months after the wedding that wasn't, at a mutual friend's barbecue neither of us realized the other would be at. The conversation was short and stiff and entirely necessary. He told me he didn't hate me, that he'd had time to think about it, and had come to understand that a woman who leaves you at the altar for someone else was never fully yours to lose in the first place. That the real loss had happened long before that morning in the chapel. He just hadn't known it yet. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more useful than forgiveness. It was a man deciding not to let bitterness cost him more than the wedding already had. I respected him for that more than I know how to say. Sabrina's parents needed time, too. Time to separate the shock of the moment from the years of quiet history underneath it. Time to stop replaying every family dinner and every Thanksgiving, looking for signs they'd apparently missed. Renata, in particular, took nearly a year before she could look at me across a table, without something complicated crossing her face first. But she came around eventually, the way most people eventually come around to happiness they didn't see coming. And the day she hugged me at Christmas and told me she was glad her daughter had finally stopped settling for careful, I had to excuse myself to the kitchen for a minute before anyone saw my face. Weddings that collapse in front of 200 witnesses do not stay quiet either. And I want to be honest about that part too, because it wasn't all slow-motion healing and heartfelt reconciliations. Half the guest list had some version of the story posted online before we'd even left the parking lot. For a few uncomfortable weeks, Sabrina and I were the exact kind of gossip neither of us had ever wanted to be. Old college acquaintances reached out with thinly disguised curiosity. A cousin of Bennett's left an angry comment under a years-old photo. The kind of comment strangers leave when they've decided they understand your whole story from one wedding day rumor. We stopped checking. We had to. Some fires you can't fight from inside them. You just let them burn themselves out while you focus on the one thing that's actually true. 6 months later, Sabrina and I sat on the porch of the house I'd just finished designing for the two of us. And she told me that if she had it to do over again, she would still hand me that letter in the coat room, still stop mid-vow in front of everyone she loved. Still risk every ounce of humiliation that came with it. Because the alternative was spending the rest of her life married to the wrong man, while wondering every single day what would have happened if she'd finally been brave enough to ask. A year after that, I asked her to marry me for real in her parents' backyard, where we used to eat cereal together as kids. No string lights required this time, just the two of us and a ring I'd been carrying around in my pocket for 3 nervous weeks. She said yes before I even finished the sentence, which she still claims was efficient and I still claim was cheating. And when people ask us now how we ended up together, Sabrina tells them she handed me a letter and made me promise not to open it unless I was sure. I tell them the actual truth, which is that I was sure the whole time. I just needed someone brave enough to ask the question out loud before I finally found the courage to answer it. So tell me, if you were standing in that coat room and someone you'd loved in silence for years handed you a sealed letter 40 minutes before marrying somebody else, would you have opened it right then or waited as I did? And have you ever buried a feeling so deep you convinced yourself it wasn't even real anymore until someone finally gave you permission to be sure? Drop a comment and tell me your own story. And while you're down there, let me know which city or country you're watching this from right now. If you liked this one, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.